biospheres are sites of sustainable development, and research is one of the 3 global functions of the UNESCO Biosphere, so it's really excellent that we've got this thread, sustainable thread in the festival. Presentations will last 25 minutes in this room, 10 minutes of questions and a few moments to join or rejoin or go out or whatever in between, and then 7 presentations altogether. Dr. Fox has set the scene really well in our climate emergency. We're growing our understanding of the role of carbon plays in this, but what about blue carbon? Could the sea be less the grey lumpy stuff that stops the boat going in the morning, more one of the key solutions to our climate crisis? We're joined today by marine scientists Rowan Hemphill and Jackie Keenan to tell us about their work on the Isle of Man government's innovative blue carbon project.
Thank you, Jo. Thank you. Nice to see you all here, and we're very happy to be here today. So I'm Jackie and this is Rowan. And yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about the project. First of all, we'll explain a little bit about blue carbon and what it is. I don't know if you don't know what it is yet, and why it's important. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the project, what we're aiming to do and how, what we've done so far and what we're aiming to do next. But first of all, handily, we've got a very short, very beautiful 10-minute film which tells you a lot of that, so we're going to go into that first.
There is a small island in the Irish Sea, surrounded by clear, shallow waters, home to wondrous wildlife. A place so special that it has been given international biosphere status. The Isle of Man. People here have always lived with and by the sea. We get food from the sea, work at sea, and play in the sea. We've learned to look after the sea because our lives depend on it. Now, we are all facing the climate crisis, and fisheries worldwide are running out of fish. The people of this island are pulling together to ensure a future for our children.
As an alien soldier levemos na agatí, Niada chan amugana, leis proflasa vegetain.
Growing up here in these waters, we were both inspired to become marine scientists and work to protect what we love.
There are so many things we can do to combat climate change, and we're working on one of these solutions right here in the waters around our island.
There are plants and algae growing in the shallow waters around our place, meadows of seagrass, forests of kelp. They protect the land by taking the force out of the waves and stabilizing the seabed. They're also vital nursery grounds for young marine life. If we protect these habitats, they will help protect us.
To fight climate change, as well as reducing carbon emissions, we need to draw carbon out of the atmosphere. Carbon isn't just in the air, it's also dissolved in the sea. This is where the sea grasses, kelp and mammals come in. They absorb carbon really rapidly as they grow. They also catch particles floating by in water, and all this carbon gets stored safely away in the seabed. This is called blue carbon. These plants and animals in the sea are precious allies for humans right now and must be protected for all our futures.
To protect our seas and the carbon it holds, we need to know how much carbon we have and where. Leading scientists from the National Oceanography Centre have come to the island to help us study our blue carbon stores.
One of the things that really interests me is the role the oceans play in locking carbon up. And that, of course, is so important at the moment, because if carbon is locked up in our oceans, it's not in our atmosphere.
So what we do to study that is we take hollow tubes and we push those into the sediments as far as they'll go, and then when we pull them out, we get essentially a nice long pipe of that sediment, which we can take back to a lab. So we can take a look at the sediment from top to bottom, and we can see how much carbon is stored within that sediment.
And this, of course, is really important information for the Manx government with a view to maximising the carbon that is locked up in the seas around the island. What the island's doing here is really pioneering.
Because we've got control over our territorial seas, it gives us the ability to move, to put legislation in place, to change things, to set up experimental areas that you wouldn't be able to elsewhere. So that makes the Isle of Man able to lead the world in looking at these projects.
So we can protect and restore our plants and animals in the sea that store carbon. What does that mean for our fishing industry?
We've actually brought those two things together, fisheries and conservation, and established a network of marine protected areas which extend over 50% of the 0 to 3 mile area. So within them there's protected populations of scallops or lobsters or crabs, and they produce larvae which drift out and settle on the commercial fishing ground. There's a kind of a win-win situation between conservation and fisheries, and that's really a unique feature of the Isle of Man.
The Isle of Man is leading the way in sustainable fishing, especially for scallop populations. We carry out regular surveys which tell us where the best spots are, so we can target those areas and become much more efficient. And the surveys go back for 30 or 40 years, so we've got a very long data set. Every single time that a fishing boat goes out, it acts as a research vessel. We have a smartphone app which allows the fishermen to tell us exactly where they've been fishing, how many bags they've caught, how long they've been fishing for.
General fishing ground rule, and then it just asks for a rough GPS position of the map in this area.
We then use that to set catch limits for the next week, or we advise people on which area they should fish in. The advantage of that is that the seabed contact is reduced, and that's good for the environment.
It's hard to tell the picture of any fishing industry at the moment, but it looks pretty good here because of the way they look after it. There's a strong effort made here in protecting the fisheries.
And so when we think about blue carbon, there are benefits there for the fishermen as well. That you're protecting the habitats, there are blue carbon benefit, but you're also providing yourself with the nursery grounds for tomorrow's fishing and next year's fishing and your sons and daughters fishing as well.
Ramsey Bay is a fantastic example of how if we give space for nature to do its thing, we can have a thriving and sustainable fishery. The scallops there are of really high quality and they are surrounded by nature that's thriving.
We, as an industry, asked for it to be closed in 2009 because we felt it had been overfished. So we closed it for 4 years, and then we started surveying the area, and the authorities started to improve. In 2013, we started fishing it, and have been fishing it every year since then. It's a great place to have learned all these lessons which we're now applying to the rest of the territorial sea.
Growing up, I knew how important that fish conservation and sustainable fisheries are because we've seen how fish stocks can come and go and the devastating impact that that can have. I'm absolutely convinced that the Manx fishing fleet are committed to being custodians of the marine environment. People can invest here because they know that it's sustainably managed and the seas are healthy.
This shows that we can have food production that is profitable whilst protecting and restoring our living seas. Blue carbon has benefits for other island businesses too.
Businesses have a very pressing need to demonstrate that we're doing our bit on the journey to net zero carbon. And the high quality carbon offsetting that blue carbon may go to provide is an essential part of that. Being a place that has a strong, sustainable approach to development will keep a lot of businesses here and attract a lot of other businesses. So I think there's a huge amount of interest right across the business community.
Here on our island, our sense of community and our sense of pride are everything. Whether by birth or by choice, this is our home, this is our island, and this is our sea.
The community we have is so positive, wanting to engage in these projects and wanting to contribute, and we need to enable that.
The facts that some of the children I've worked with over the last couple of weeks have come out with about nature and the sea, and it's really great to see that they're already engaged in their environment. I'm really hopeful that the connection that they're making with the sea is a lot stronger even than mine.
I'd like to see abundance and diversity of life that's thriving, that everyone gets to enjoy for generations to come.
It's really exciting to see the collaboration that's already happening in the Blue Carbon Project, and everybody can see the value that looking after our blue carbon has. As a small, independent island community, we can work together to restore and protect our island seas, make the most of its blue carbon, and to lead the way for other islands and coastal areas to do the same.
I'd love to see a future where our marine environment is protected, where we have a real understanding of the opportunities that exist under the sea. The people on the Isle of Man can really truly value it and preserve it for future generations, because I don't want it just to be my children and their children. I want it to really be forever a future for all of us, where the carbon is well managed, where climate change is a thing that we have solved, and I believe we have a real opportunity here to be a big part of that.
Stop before we get to the outtakes. But they are quite entertaining if you look back on them on YouTube. So, I should really be able to ask you guys after watching that fantastic film what blue carbon is, but it's still relatively early and I think the coffee van's only just arrived, so I'll save you. Blue carbon, like trees, peatland, grasslands on land, blue carbon is the habitats in our seas that naturally store carbon. The good thing about storing carbon in the sea is that it can be stored for a really, really long time if it's protected. And often these habitats are far more efficient at capturing carbon than their terrestrial counterparts. The kind of big three hitters in the blue carbon world globally are seagrass, mangroves and salt marsh. But you can probably tell me that you don't see many mangroves around here yet anyway with our climate. So we have, in terms of what we can put on our nationally determined contributions, which is essentially the IPCC's report, Dr. King's, that Dr. King was talking about earlier, it's our audit essentially of our emissions and our removals. So at the moment we can put our seagrass and salt marsh on our nationally determined contributions, but we have a wealth of other really interesting carbon-rich habitats that we're studying as part of this project. So that includes the beautiful kelp forests around our island, and hopefully you've had an opportunity to swim or maybe snorkel in those, they're really beautiful. And we have some marine sediment off the west coast of our island. We have a huge patch of marine sediment, which is far less sexy compared to the other habitats, but it's really important for carbon storage, and it actually is probably one of our most important carbon stores because of the sheer size of it. Then we also have other more dynamic biogenic habitats, such as merle. Merle is a pink coralline algae, and horse mussel reefs, which form these really dense reefs. And their role in the carbon cycle is still kind of being researched. A lot of this research is still quite cutting edge, and they think that perhaps these large reefs are forming caps over carbon, where the detritus falls below and potentially forming carbon storage caps. But these habitats are really important for biodiversity and lots of other services that benefit humans. So part of this project is really about managing our seas holistically, not only for carbon, but also for biodiversity and the other services it provides.
So we talked in the film a little bit about why blue carbon is important, but Dr. Fox talked about touched on the Paris Agreement. So that's an agreement, an international agreement for countries to reach net zero by 2050, and it's an agreement that we've signed up to. Net zero, if you don't know what it is, means that by 2050, any emissions that we are still putting out are balanced out with any carbon that's being stored away. And we've already talked about today the need to rapidly decarbonise our society, changing the way we live, changing the way we consume, how we move, so that by 2050 there's very little carbon emissions that we then balance out with that natural and some technological absorption of carbon. But we also as a nation have our own plans, strategies, action plans that we've committed to. We have a biodiversity strategy, we've got a 5-year climate change action plan which says exactly how we're going to start moving towards that net zero. And also the health of our seas as a nation, with 85% of our territory in the sea, is integral to our island plan and economic strategy as well. And obviously we are the only whole nation biosphere reserve, and it's important that we respect that status as well. This is a very busy slide that I wish I'd changed. But I'm going to tell you what I would have changed. I would just concentrate on this wheel in the middle. It's the ecosystem functions, ecosystem services that Rowan mentioned. It's all of the many things that a healthy sea and a marine ecosystem does for us without us even asking. It's cleaning our water, cleaning our air, it's providing food, it's providing coastal protection, and also on the Isle of Man, whether you were born here or not, That cultural connection to the sea is really vital and important as well, and for me certainly a spiritual connection to the sea. So it's all of the other ecosystem functions that a healthy marine ecosystem does for us, which, and the reason for all the other things around the sides, benefit all of the other sustainable development goals that Dr. Fox also mentioned, and they come under the work of all of the other government departments, apart from the one that's just responsible for the environment.
So that brings us to our project. What are we trying to do? We are a 3-year project. We have 3 years of funding. And essentially our job is to understand how much carbon is stored in our marine environment and understand what we can do to manage that carbon to maximise it. So it can be a climate ally for us and a nature-based solution. I failed to mention this at the start, but I always think it's really important to mention that we don't think that blue carbon is a silver bullet solution for climate change. But it is a really important nature-based solution, and I think we need to have a whole plethora of tools in our toolbox to respond to the challenges that we face. So our official aim is to develop a management plan that maximises carbon captured and stored in our waters, whilst maintaining and restoring biodiversity and ecosystem services. You can really break that down into 3 aims. Our primary aim being to maximise the carbon that we're storing there naturally, to help us on our journey to net zero. And our secondary aims are really to maintain and restore those wider ecosystem functions and the biodiversity of those habitats. Because we want to be working along this journey with nature and making sure that we're restoring these habitats back to what they once were.
So that's quite a lot that we want to achieve in those in that aim, those 3 sub-aims, if you like. And so how are we going to do it? So we can kind of break it down into 4 different sections. So we're mapping out what we have, what blue carbon ecosystems do we have around our island and where are they. Luckily, we've got a really rich history of marine science on the island, having had the Marine Lab down in Port Erin for so long. So we're in a pretty good position with that, but Rowan will talk a little bit more about how we're progressing that. Then looking at how much carbon is stored there and how quickly it's being stored away. Next, determining the potential threats to those ecosystems, to what could damage them or destroy them and threaten that carbon storage and all of the ecosystem functions, and how we can reduce those threats. And finally, restoration is supposed to be one word, exploring restoration potential. What is the potential for either restoring those areas actively, which if you go to the Manx Wildlife talk later on, they'll talk a little bit about what they're looking at, but also about how we can restore just through protection. So quite often if you protect an area, remove those possible threats, then nature does its thing and it restores naturally anyway. So we started in February last year. It's a 3-year project, so going to February 2025, so we are just over halfway through, which is a great thing, but also quite intimidating in looking at what we're trying to do in creating a management strategy. So obviously we're at the Research Festival. Research is a big part of the project, and a really cost-effective way of doing research is by funding PhDs. So we have 2 PhD students. You saw Hannah in the film, so she's the National Oceanography Centre, which is great to say, so we call it the NOC, and Swansea University, and she is mapping out the blue carbon habitats and looking at that carbon content. Rowan's going to talk about her research in a moment. We've also got a researcher at Bangor University. She's only just started, so she has just started her research progress, and she's looking at those interactions between fisheries and blue carbon, particularly in the sexy muddy sediments that Rowan mentioned on the western coast of our seas, which is also quite heavily trawled at the moment. We don't have any results from her at the moment. Another really important part of research, and it's becoming more important part of not just research but general working life, and it's something that I think that we need to teach in schools and colleges and universities more, is collaboration. There's a real need to work across disciplines, across sectors, to not just be working within scientific communities or within the decision makers community, but working across different areas. So we formed the Blue Carbon Working Group very early in the project, and that brings people from across the government, but also from external agencies, experts from the climate change team, such as we have here, scientists, researchers, the Department of Infrastructure and the Seabird, so it's really important that they're involved along the way. And we've already heard in the film as well, business and innovation is one of the key sectors that we're working with. Businesses want to be doing the right thing, not just to be seen to be doing the right thing. It's important that we work with them so they can fund the projects that we need to have.
so far? What has our research told us so far? You will have to forgive me. This is Hannah's research. I'm going to do my best to summarise it and take any of your questions, but just take with a pinch of salt that this is not all my research. So, Hannah at the National Oceanography Centre in Swansea University has really been helping us to build up that picture of our entire territorial sea, which is 85% of our territory, so a really large area. But you know, she's standing on the shoulders of giants. There's a huge amount of work that has been done in our territorial seas thanks to the Marine Biological Station down in Port Erin. And this first part of the project has really been about mapping our coastal area and taking cores around our coastline in that offshore area to build up an understanding of how much carbon is being stored there and how much carbon is being captured on an annual basis. To map our coastal areas, we've been using some really exciting bits of technology. We've been using drones, which is a really effective way of getting a lot of data very quickly, and we can actually pick out the signals from, in our shallow coastal seas where it's nice and calm and clear, you can actually then pick out the signals from kelp and seagrass and help differentiate between them and essentially map our coastal area without having to send divers in the water for hours and hours and hours and hours. You know, I love getting in the sea, but it's not that effective. I'll be here till I was about 85 if we're doing that in that process. We've also been using side-scan sonar, which is essentially towing a sonar along behind a boat and reading the signal that comes back, and that can also tell us about the different habitats. So we can build up a picture of our coastal zone. We've been taking cores all around our coastline and offshore, which has involved glamorously hammering a soil pipe into the ground all around the island and firing perspex tubes down to the bottom of the seafloor, which is in around up to 100 metres worth of water. So it's been quite incredible to be able to get as many cores as we have. We have around 80 cores so far, so we're really building up a really fantastic picture. And the real benefit of this research, you know, we're a small island, but the real benefit of this research is that has implications on a wider research field, and we can look at an entire territorial system, and that can be scaled up to other jurisdictions that wouldn't be able to have the resources to look at their entire territory. Here's a map of some of the areas that we've been looking at. We've been looking at those more traditional blue carbon habitats, such as the salt marsh at Poole Dewey or Port Cornet, but we've also been looking at some interesting dynamic habitats on our beaches and seeing what happens there, where you see seaweed washing up in the winters and then being stored by layers of sediment. What's happening there? Are they carbon stores? Or are they things that we don't need to think about or manage? So I'd ask you not to take any photos or tweet any of this research. This is Hannah's initial preliminary results, and she hasn't published yet. And you can see here the percentage of carbon in the cores and the depth of the cores. So you can see all the sites that we've been surveying in our nearshore area. And as you might expect, our salt marshes hold the most carbon, but it gives us it helps us to understand that we really need to protect those habitats for their carbon that they're storing. And then, as maybe you might expect, those dynamic coastal beach environments have got lower carbon because of the waves and the storms that come in the winter really mixing that up and creating really dynamic habitats that don't store carbon so naturally. In our offshore area, again, you can see percentage of carbon along the top and the depth of the cores, and you can see that there is a variation between the amount of carbon that's stored in that mud up. And as you can see that the actual carbon content of those cores decreases slightly with depths. I'm not expecting you to fully understand this very messy graph, but what I can tell you is that our results align well with the results being collected around the UK in terms of the carbon content of our cores within our territorial area, which is good because it can help and means that we can use research from other areas to inform our management as well. So we have an idea of how much carbon is being stored there, but how do we figure out how much carbon is being captured on an annual basis? Now, I think this is really, really interesting stuff. Hannah's come up with a really novel approach. So many of you will probably be aware that we have a nuclear power station in Sellafield across the water from us. And over the last century or so, we tended to have the tagline, the solution to pollution is dilution. Luckily, we don't kind of adhere to that idea anymore. But what we can do is look at the discharge from different chemical levels from the Sellafield nuclear plant and effectively it can help us timestamp the sediment cores, because those chemicals settle over the seabed, more sediment comes down, and essentially we have a nice core that has different levels of this chemical. So we've chosen cesium to look at the level of cesium activity, and essentially here you can see that 1975 was a peak year for cesium discharge in the Irish Sea, and actually you can look in comparison to the core, which is on your left. I'm out of my left and right. And you can see peaks in the data. So that helps us to understand that this is sediment that fell in 1972, 1975, and then you can start understanding and building a picture of how much sediment is falling and being accumulated on an annual basis. And with that, and you know how much carbon is in there, you can start understanding how much carbon is being captured on an annual basis. Very clever, and I hope you understood what I said, because it didn't explain very well. Hannah insisted I put this slide in, and I'll go over it very briefly, but basically it's just showing that you can do this with other chemical compounds. You know the old 137C radionuclide? It's one of my favourite compounds. But essentially, it's a robust way. You can look at the profiles of different chemical compounds and develop a really robust way of understanding what's happening to the sediment over time.
So that's what we've done so far. What are we going to be doing next? We're going to be carrying on filling out this inventory of what are our blue carbon habitats and how much they store, and developing a management plan to look after it. Continue looking at identifying those threats, not just at sea, but also from the land. So obviously it is one interconnected system, so how can we manage any potential threats from the land as well. Continuing working with our stakeholders, our researchers, the fishing community and others, on ways to protect and restore blue carbon, and how can we protect the existing vulnerable habitats that we have appropriately and effectively. We've been doing a lot of engagement, so talks like this, but also workshops with schools, and it's been really exciting to talk to the great public about our sea. I think we can take it for granted sometimes, and it's, I think if we can value all of the things that our sea offers us, and a healthy marine environment can offer us, I think it would do us all a lot of good. And working collaboratively to find innovative ways to fund blue carbon and marine conservation projects, enabling those businesses and organisations who want to fund these projects to do so, but also making sure that it's science-backed and it's good science that's being used. Developing this management plan that puts the island at the forefront of holistic marine management. I don't think that most people on the Isle of Man understand just how well the Isle of Man is seen, and certainly in fisheries management circles. We have a very sustainable, a very good reputation in terms of sustainable fisheries management globally, and quite often highlighted at conferences. So we want to make sure that we're doing that in blue carbon as well, and developing monitoring schemes to assess the success of the management approach. So it's no good us implementing these things if we don't check if they're working, and also to adjust things as science and technology moves on. It's important that we incorporate into that management plan a way that we can adjust it as it goes along and as we learn more. That is a lot of information, so if you have any questions, we would very much like to take them now. Yes?
Oh, there you go.
You first and then you.
Can I just invite, if anyone's sitting down the side, come and join us. It's a bit like those cheap seats down there, doesn't it?
What I'd like to know is how does the introduction of offshore and onshore wind farms affect carbon capture?
So offshore, certainly we need to make sure that we're putting them in the right place, and that there's potential for that if they are put in high. So we're looking at trying to create blue carbon hotspots, so where we know that there's high carbon value and the biodiversity and ecosystem services value. So we are certainly working with people on those offshore, the whole marine team in DEFRA are working with the people looking at offshore wind farms as to where they can be put to make sure that blue carbon isn't impacted.
Yeah, it comes down to marine spatial planning essentially. You know, we all live on land and we manage our activities accordingly. We decide what's important for wildlife, where do we want to have developed areas, and that all has to be backed by science and information to inform those decisions. So this project, in mapping our blue carbon resources and identifying really important areas for biodiversity, carbon and ecosystem services, we can manage our sea in a way that works for everybody. The idea that we're not part of nature, I think, is a relatively old one, and we need to realise that we need to work with nature, informed by science research, so that we can live in an aligned, low-carbon future.
I think we have worked with nature, but when you introduce something like an offshore wind farm, you're actually causing an interruption in nature, aren't you? Because, all right, you might say it gets churned up, there's no carbon capture there, but it's actually part of the process, isn't it? So how, it's a very complex issue, but you can't just go and put these things up, and this is what's worrying a lot of people.
Yeah.
Onshore and offshore, because they're saying, oh, well, we'll plant some trees here and that. You're actually, say you do it on land in an area where you've got like a spongy area, which should probably be a carbon capture area. It manages the moisture content, and if you put something in an area like that where it's a wet, quite wet, water has to go somewhere. And likewise in the sea, you're putting something in and interrupt, so you're pushing marine life eventually into other areas.
I think we're actually, now more than ever, more aware of our impact on the environment. You say that we've been working with nature. I'd say that probably over the last 200-300 years we haven't been, but the sources of pollution have been somewhat invisible to us. We've been treating the seas essentially out of sight, out of mind, and we've been pouring all sorts into it. The question around offshore wind farms being a new form of impact on the marine environment, and with the idea that we haven't been creating an impact on the marine environment for hundreds and hundreds of years. But I would say the difference now is that we're very much aware that we have an effect on the environment, and we do environmental impact assessments to understand the impact of our actions on those areas. But we're also in a very challenging position that if we don't start generating energy in a clean way, it's going to adversely affect all of nature and our own lives. So it's a really tricky balance. And if we were making these decisions 40 years ago, or back in the 1930s, unfortunately we've created a huge amount of damage. And that's why projects like this are really making sure that we are protecting what we have left, and making sure that we are considering nature when we're making these large decisions in our marine space.
You could go on, because a lot of this impact, the damages we're doing, are not working with nature, has been big business, saying that the consumer demands, but the consumer never asks for plastic bottles.
Just to give someone else a chance to answer some questions. Maybe
Yeah, I'll stop now.
Just do it.
Just really quickly to add, it's, like you said, it's a very complex problem, and that's why with our project and with a lot of the projects that are happening, there's an understanding that we have to work across different sectors, and not just within government and not just in government silos. Like, we're really passionate about that. We have to work with people because it's complex problems, and we need all that expertise.
Any questions on the Mansfield Carbon project?
I'm fascinated by seaweed. Living in Peel, we have lots of it coming up on the beach. And excuse me, my understanding is that years ago the farmers would take that and put it on their fields and utilize it. So, question, sorry I was out for a bit and didn't hear your whole presentation, but are you looking at how much seaweed is sequestered, how much it covers seaweed? And is it significant? And is there any thought to utilizing that somehow?
So seaweed is really, I'm also obsessed with seaweed. I think it's really interesting. The key difference between seaweed and kelps compared to other traditional blue carbon systems is that the likes of salt marsh and seagrass take the carbon and store it in sediment below, whereas kelp tends to hold fast onto a rock. So there's a really interesting area of research about what happens to that seaweed. Some washes up on the beach, like in Peel, but they think that a certain percentage of that seaweed actually goes off into the deep water and is stored for long periods of time. So actually looking at some of those offshore cores, we're looking at the markers from the eDNA and understanding, is kelp in that carbon, in that offshore mud sediment? Is it being stored? Is it acting like a pump, taking that carbon from the atmosphere and pumping it into the deep ocean? I think kelp aquaculture is a really interesting area of kind of innovative climate research, because it doesn't require any fertilizer, it just needs sea and a little bit of space and sunshine. we've been approached by a few people wanting to do interesting projects. It's sometimes about getting through the logistics of trying to start these infrastructure projects on the island, but I think it's a really, really interesting area of research.
So we're also, as well as collaborating, sorry, I keep on bashing back collaborating, don't I? But as well as working with people on island, we are also a part of this whole Blue Carbon community worldwide, particularly we're part of the UK Blue Carbon Forum and going to a conference in December to make sure that we're connecting with all the blue carbon research projects and scientists, so that those people who are specialising in that area and we're hoping to take that information and be able to implement it into our management plan as well.
Thank you. Yeah.
So this gentleman had a question. So.
I thought the unique idea about the carbon capture that I showed was that they're biochar in it.
Yeah.
And it seems to me like that would be a pretty simple thing
You
to
say that's
have
in
a
Cornwall?
biochar facility here.
But yeah, you said it was down in Cornwall they're doing it.
Yeah, Cornwall.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
I think the project's fantastic. Now you've got 4,000 square kilometres of territorial waters on the island. If you look at the carbon cycle of what we're talking about, on and offshore wind turbines, you've got the attendant mining beforehand, you know, 250,000 tonnes per 1,000 tonnes of concrete, all this type of thing. The oils that are used in the gearbox, the damage to the seabeds and the land, and then you've got the disposal of blades, which seems to be a problem, as well as what you're going to do with all the stanchions and the does it not make more sense to go further with what you're doing? Because I could totally get behind this and not have all these problems. And also, you've got another problem. You talked about net zero. That's global, isn't it? But 2/3 of the world are putting up coal and gas power stations, like China and India and Pakistan, Iran, etc., etc.
I think we're going a bit wider than that.
No, but it's all about carbon and the net zero thing.
Sure, yeah, but
so what I'm thinking is, I could totally get behind you. If I was funding you, I'd give you all those hundreds of billions that have been given to wind farms, tear them all down, because the CO2, if you're going to talk about CO2 as a pollutant rather than a plant food, I would suggest that your solution is far more interesting than anything that's being done at the moment. I would totally get behind what you're doing.
Unfortunately, you know, I'm a huge advocate for restoring and protecting our environment, and luckily that it provides an ally for us in terms of our challenge of climate change. But our natural environment doesn't have the capacity to store the carbon that we are producing through our lifestyles.
You see, I would go geothermal and what you're doing, because then you haven't got any of the CO2 emissions from power generation, and you've also got the spin-off of heat, which you don't get with wind turbines.
I think what we tried to highlight in our presentation is that it's one piece of the puzzle.
Well, I think you should think bigger.
I think we're trying to think as big as we can, but we also have to understand the capacity that there is to, like, when we're talking about restoration, we've been approached by people who want to do restoration projects which are just totally unrealistic in the environment that we live in. So seagrass is a great absorber of carbon. However, it grows in very specific areas and specific habitats and conditions. We don't necessarily have the capacity to put 4,000 square kilometres of
But don't forget, University of Virginia, they've just been doing seagrasses to ameliorate storm surges in the sea.
It's very
that
well
would save a
understood
huge amount of money in storm damage.
It's very well understood that that is one of the ecosystem functions of the seagrass beds. However, it's not appropriate to grow seagrass everywhere. It's not appropriate to grow kelp everywhere. It's a massively intricate and complex ecosystem, and it needs lots of different areas. And it's one piece of the puzzle to blue carbon, one piece of decarbonising our society, and one piece of decarbonising our society is going to be renewable energy. How we do that, we are not here to answer that question. However, we understand it's we understand it's a complex.
Thank you very much. Question, just make this the final question because we're running well over time. You can pick up outside.
This is wonderful because it indicates how quickly things become very complicated.
Yeah.
It sounds like a great thing to do, of course, and everybody in this room, I'm sure, is very supportive. So nothing I say should be contrary to that. I was struck by you're using the cesium indicator of the spike, which was, as I understand it, caused by an accidental discharge.
Yeah, so that's why I think there's the two particular spikes in 72 and 75. Yeah.
Right. To many people, they send a message don't do this, don't have Sellafield, although of course Sellafield's a part much more than generating the energy, it's about getting rid of the mess that's been created in the past. But it's of course also a sign that you've got an overarching goal which is to maximise carbon retention in Manx space. But of course that's not really the best kind of objective you can have, because the Isle of Man government is selling energy which is generated from diesel, making money out of it. So it's a contradiction, you're creating more. And you don't want to be the dustbin of the world, which is, if you want to maximise the storage, then you would start importing seaweed.
Can we get a question?
So to put it into a simple question, which is how does your project account for the interactions between what you're doing and what you can do in Mexico, and what's happening in the rest of the Irish Sea?
So we are working collaboratively with people from around the whole UK and in Ireland as well, and looking at what they're doing. So we understand that it's an internet-connected system, and that not just in the Irish Sea, but the whole world. It's just one closed ecosystem. So we are working with other people to understand what's happening elsewhere and how we can work together. And looking at, in terms of management, we know that there's protected areas outside of our waters that are adjacent to areas that aren't protected. So is there ways that we can work with those and make larger protected areas, or looking at our management in our territorial waters, are there ways that can be extended further outside? But yeah, we are working collaboratively with people outside of the Isle of Man as well. We understand that it's not just enough to do it just here. But it's a good ecosystem to start doing it.
It's Jackie and Rowan, you'll be here for a while.
Yes.
Many other subjects, yeah. So we've run out of time, unfortunately, because obviously it's a very broad topic and there's lots and lots of interest.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.